go. All right. So, as I just mentioned, this is a follow-up to the premiere of The Story of Plastic. If you want more information about The Story of Plastic and that film, check them out at storyofplastic.org. Priscilla is also going to be involved in another community screening of this movie this evening, actually. So she'll give you more information about that in a couple of minutes. Eureka Recycling is hosting this webinar. If you are not all familiar, well, first off, I'm Kat Lund. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Eureka. I've been with Eureka for just a little over 3 years now, and I'm involved in a variety of different work, including up to most recently, public tours. So of course our work is changing a little bit with the whole situation with COVID. So here we are on our very first semi-organized webinar. So thanks again for joining us. So Eureka is a nonprofit zero waste organization. We're a social enterprise recycler. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we are only we're one of a handful of nonprofit recyclers left in the country. We have been here in the Twin Cities Metro providing recycling services and zero waste education since 2001. Our recycling fleet actually just celebrated their 17th anniversary on Earth Day this last week. So we were excited to celebrate that. And if you follow us on Facebook or Instagram, you saw us post there. So please, if you don't follow us on social media, please do. And you can keep up with some of these conversations that we're having about these important topics there too. So we have a number of Eurekans here today to talk about plastic and plastics recycling. We'll be hearing from a couple of them, and then we'll have about 30 minutes we're planning for Q&A at the end. So please do, if you have some specific questions that you want answered today, please check out the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and get your questions in there, and we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. But we've got Lynn Hoffman and Kate Davenport here today with us, both co-presidents of Eureka Recycling. And then we also have Priscilla Villawat, who is our new policy and advocacy manager at Eureka. Priscilla comes just recently as a new transplant from Texas, where she worked with communities who are directly impacted by fracking and plastic production. And she's going to talk a little bit about plastic production and give us the insight into the back end of plastic production. And then we're going to take it all the way through to how plastic comes through our facility and how we deal with it on our end. So yeah, without further ado, I think we'll let Priscilla just take it away and we can start hearing about plastic production.
All right, thanks, Kat.
Sounds good. Let me just stop sharing here. There we go. You got it, Priscilla.
All right, thanks. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay. So first off, I just want to thank everybody who joined us last Friday for our community screening of The Story of Plastics. It's an amazing documentary. If you haven't checked it out, please let us know, and we're happy to connect you with some links and other community organizations who are doing screenings tonight and next Friday. So today I'm going to be really focusing about how plastic is this like forefront issue in the environmental space, why it's connected to fossil fuels, and why we're seeing such a demand in plastic production. So as Kat mentioned, I was an organizer in Texas and worked directly with people who were impacted by fossil fuels. So for those of you who don't know, 99% of all plastics are based of fossil fuels. And that's basically just like one chemical compound that is extracted out of the ground and used for plastic production. And that's from everything to like your plastic water bottles, plastic bags, keyboards, like anything that you can think of really just comes from this one chemical compound, which I'll get into a little bit. But first off, so how do we extract fossil fuels from the ground? I realize that there isn't a lot of fracking here, or any really in Minnesota. So what that looks like and what the process is really just drilling a hole down into the ground to reach a shale formation that's about 1 to 2 miles beneath the surface. And so conventional drilling back in the old days, the way that oil was drilled was just vertically straight down. they hit a hole and the oil would just kind of gush up to the top. Now with fracking, you can go at a 90-degree angle. So that cracks the rock in several different spaces. And the water, sand, and chemicals get shot into the rock formation. And the sand is what helps prop open the cracks in the rock. And that's what allows the oil and gas to flow out up into the ground, into the surface. So the reason why I like using this infographic here is because the water table is shown really clearly. So what happens in places where there's fracking is that a lot of these chemicals get leaked into the water table. So people who have private water wells will see contamination in their water supply. So this is what it actually looks like in real life. And this is a photo taken in South Texas, where I did a lot of my work prior to moving to Minnesota. And so what you see here is sort of this Eiffel-looking tower in the middle, and that is the drilling rig. That's what shoots down those chemicals and makes the hole into the well, or creates the well in the ground. And that whole process takes just about 6 weeks, but it's really intensive, takes tons and tons of water. And these operations are up 24/7. And just to give you some context, these facilities, especially in Texas, are as close to 400 feet from someone's backyard. So when that water and chemicals come back up into the ground, it usually gets stored in like this little pool that you see here in the photo. And that wastewater, again, is super toxic. It's radioactive. And it either evaporates into the air, it will seep into the ground if there's no lining. Sometimes it gets injected into another hole in the ground. And that's usually actually what ends up causing earthquakes. If you've heard about fracking and earthquakes, it's because that wastewater is injected into the ground and just kind of stays there. So it creates, those platelet movements. So once the fracking process is all said and done, you have a pump jack, which you kind of see in the back of the site there. It's that black hammer-looking machinery, and so that pumps up the oil and gas and transports it via a pipeline to a storage facility or a processing facility. So for those of you who may have seen the story of plastics, you may have seen a lot of flares in the film. So a flare is usually either on site or near the sites where they're fracking, and what a flare does is it just burns off all of the excess chemicals or gas that it doesn't have a market, doesn't have an end market. And so they'll just kind of burn it off into the atmosphere. Again, super toxic. There are regulations around how long they should be burning, but oftentimes they're burning all throughout the night. I worked with someone in the community who had insomnia because these flares are really bright. So it caused a lot of light pollution and of course air pollution as well. So you can actually see some homes there in the background behind the flare. To give you some context of where fracking happens, it's in a lot of places in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Colorado, Pennsylvania. It's basically where you see all those blue highlighted places. Those are what we call shale plays. So I want to make a really clear distinction between dry gas and wet gas. And there are places across the country where there are shale plays that have both. There are shale plays that are mostly dry, and there are shale plays that are mostly wet. So in Texas, for example, we have a mixture of dry and wet gas. And dry gas is really just methane. There's not much else in it. And wet gas is a little bit of methane, but it also contains natural gas liquids. And amongst those liquids is ethane. And ethane is the building block of all plastic. So you can see here that the fracking boom kind of happened in the early 2000s. And since then, there has been this uptick in production of that wet gas or ethane. And if I were to show you a chart of plastic production since then, you would see that it's the exact same increase in production. And that's just because there's been an oversupply of ethane produced from fracking. And so there's been an uptick in plastic production as a result of that. So how do you get from ethane to plastic? Well, ethane gets cracked in a cracker facility from a single bonded molecule to a double bonded molecule, and it gets turned into polyethylene. And so what polyethylene actually looks like are those little plastic pellets or nurdles. You can see in my video here, these little tiny little things that get melted down and create all of the plastic that's pretty much out in the market. Lynn will talk more a little bit about this, but because the price of gas is so cheap, that impacts it makes a competitive market for recycled plastics, because recycled plastics cost more than this cheap virgin plastics that just come straight from a frack well. So here's just kind of big picture. You go from ethylene chains, you go from fracking site, you extract the ethane, it gets cracked at a cracker, and then it gets turned into every plastic that you can think of, from pool liners and cups, diapers, toys, adhesives, all kinds of things. So it's really that ethane compound that creates all the plastic that, again, is in our market. So I'll talk about crackers in a little bit, and I don't mean the fun kind that you can eat with cheese. These are really terrible crackers. But first I want to kind of emphasize that there's an uptick in plastic production, not because there's more consumer demand, but because there's just more supply of ethane. And so what oil and gas companies are doing, which are also essentially plastic companies, are investing billions of dollars, $164 billion in new infrastructure or crackers across the United States. So they're planning about 254 new projects that would create 33% more plastic production by the year 2050. So what that means is that 20% of our oil and gas consumption would be, or production would go towards plastics. So that's a huge profit opportunity for these companies. So what is a cracker? This is a mock-up of the world's largest cracker facility being built by Exxon in Portland, Texas. This is near the bay, with the expectation that the pellets would be produced here, put on a ship, and shipped to China or Europe to be produced into plastic products. You can see there's a home just across the fence from this facility. It's a $10 billion project that spans over 1,400 acres. There's a huge community pushback here for multiple reasons. There's wildlife refuges wildlife refuges nearby. There are vulnerable waterways, not to mention communities just right around this facility. There's a high school just down the road as well. And so this is really a community cause for community concern. And one of the sort of success stories from this local fight, is that this project has been pushed back at least 3 years because of community pushback. Just emphasizing the power that communities have to really make change. So this is what, just going back here. So this looks nice and pretty with waterfalls and pools that ducks can swim in. And this is what a cracker facility actually looks like. So this photo is taken in Houston, Texas, where there's a 16-mile stretch of petrochemical sites. And just to highlight that Texas and Louisiana are one in 4 major regions of the world where most of our plastic is produced. So that's a lot. And then I also just want to highlight that this causes immediate impacts to the communities that live around these facilities. So there is a shelter-in-place advisory to 34,000 residents that lived around this fire that happened around this time last year in Houston. So shelter in place is not a new thing for people who live there, because there are accidents that happen regularly at these facilities, and people who literally live just a few feet from a lot of these facilities. So you can see all those white tanks are just filled with chemicals, gas, oil, all kinds of things that are highly combustible and can catch fire. In this event, there were 6.2 million pounds of carbon monoxide, thousands of pounds of nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and toluene that were released. And so the photo to the left is of the fire itself. The photo on the right is the skyline of Houston, so you can see that this fire stretched out pretty far. And then the photo at the top was taken from my balcony when I was still living in Houston. So it was a huge event that happened and impacted a lot of people. So talking about health impacts, over 170 fracking chemicals that are used to produce the main feedstocks for plastics have human health impacts, including cancer, neurological, reproductive, developmental toxicity, impairment of the immune system, and so much more. And they have direct and documented impacts on skin, eyes, and other sensory organs like liver and brain. In terms of refining and manufacture, transforming fossil fuels into plastic resins and additives releases carcinogenic or cancer-causing substances into the air. There are cases that people have reproductive and developmental problems like cancer, leukemia, and all kinds of really terrible health impacts. And this is, again, just from plastic production itself. And then I just want to show this graphic. So the Center for International Environmental Law did this great report on climate and plastics, and showed that basically if we go at the rate that we're going now in terms of plastic production, the amount of greenhouse gases that would come from plastic facilities would equate to the amount of 615 coal plants. So there's been a lot of push to close these coal plants, but again, if we don't focus on this plastic problem, we're going to continue to see climate change worsen because of these emissions caused from plastic production. So now that I've gone over how plastic produced and all the impacts that it has, you have plastic in your hands, so now what? Where does it go? What happens to it? And what actions can you all take to help with this big problem? So I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to talk to you about that, and then we'll get to some actions that we can all take to address the problem.
Thanks a lot, Priscilla. Can you hear me okay? Is this thing working?
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully everyone else can too. I also want to apologize in advance for any sounds of children screaming in the background. I know that's become a new normal for a lot of these virtual meetings. I'm going to share my slides from the beginning. Okay, I thought I would just start. I think most of y'all who have joined us are familiar with Eureka, but I want to just give you a very quick overview of our operations so you can understand the context and our operational experience that we use to approach the questions around what to do with plastics. From a 10,000 foot level, we've got a MRF, a material recovery facility that we operate that sorts about 100,000 tons, a little more, of residential single stream recycling every year. The majority of that material comes from the Twin Cities area. A portion of that we collect with our own fleet, our collections program, about 30 trucks, and the rest comes from other haulers in the area and other contracts. What's different and unique about, like I think Kat mentioned, there aren't very many of us nonprofit zero waste recyclers around. And what makes the difference that makes when you're approaching recycling with a mission in mind versus only profit is that you make really different decisions about how and what and where and when you recycle. So we are always making all of our decisions with our mission as the frame, looking for the balance between economic, human health, and environmental considerations. The majority of recycling is done, the operations are done by large waste hauling corporations who are, by design, by law, they're meant to extract as much profit as they can from their operations. And so when you're making decisions with that in mind, it looks a lot different. And the results are a lot of what we see in the film, The Story of Plastics. So I thought that we could start by kind of looking at the obvious. Number one, bottles, right? Soda and water bottles. Polyethylene, terephthalate, PET. You hear that ethylene in there that Priscilla was referencing. So these bottles are one of few plastics that actually really are highly recyclable and in theory in great demand. We're hearing lots of brands make commitments to use more recycled content in their bottles. Currently, the average bottle that you buy has less than 2% recycled content in it. So despite these commitments and claims, with a lack of any regulation or law, we're really not seeing a lot of movement there. Another reason for that is, like Priscilla mentioned, we're having to compete in the marketplace against very, very cheap virgin fracked gas and oil, especially right now as oil is negative. We're having a really hard time finding markets for our PET. So, globally, there's 1 million plastic bottles purchased every minute, but only 91% are not recycled. There's some information that says Minnesotans might be a little bit better. We might have a little higher capture rate than this, but the point is that the majority of even these most recyclable plastics end up in the incinerator. And really, PET isn't alone. There are studies that have shown that less than 8 or 9% of all plastics ever produced have been recycled. And then we watch The Story of Plastic, of course, and it's a reasonable question to ask after you watch a film like that is, should we be recycling plastics at all? But I think what's important to remember here is that, like anything else, how you do it matters. How you recycle matters, and not all recycling is the same. So PET collected in Minnesota does not end up choking waterways halfway around the world. It is possible for recycling to play an immediate role in mitigating harm and reducing extraction and reducing the harm of some plastics, but not all. So if you look at our pile, for example, our 400 tons a day, we have an estimated about 540,000 PET bottles in that pile that we collect every single day on our facility. So 400 tons a day is over 500,000 PET bottles in there. And if we stopped recycling plastic altogether, those would just end up in the incinerators. So I think what's important is to maybe reframe the question. Instead of, is recycling the solution to plastic? I think we need to really have a more nuanced approach and really dig into, when is recycling part of the solution and for what? So instead of asking, again, another reframing, what makes something recyclable, or is it recyclable? I think we have to really push further and talk about and look collectively at what does it take to get something recycled, actually get it recycled. You have to have enough volume, you have to be able to collect it, sort it cost effectively, and importantly, you have to have reliable, traceable, transparent end markets. So what we mean by that is that there are more than one place that wants to buy that kind of plastic once you've collected enough and sorted it by type. And they want to buy it regularly and they want to make something new. And what we mean by traceable and transparent is that we know how they're doing it, we know what it's getting turned into, and we know that in general we aren't causing more harm than good. And then of course all end markets aren't created equal. There's kind of the good, better, and best there too. And plastic most often ends up in that good range. It's made into something that probably can't be recycled again. Sometimes it can be made into a durable good. PET bottles are often made into carpet, so it's going to last a long time. But the best, the gold standard for recycling, of course, is that if you're able to take like an aluminum can and make another aluminum can and into infinity, you keep those materials in play for a long time, which is not a category that plastic often falls into. So I think to answer, there's an example that I thought we could dig into. We get this in our facility a lot. This is that insulation foam from those home delivery meal kits that I've used, we've all used. And it's made from, number one, PET, same as the material of those bottles, right? If you go, it says the arrows on it, you go online, this is what they say about it, put it in your curbside bin, this is recyclable, it's made from PET. We dug into it a little bit more, and they even went so far as to say, if your recycler won't take that, tell them to do their job. And it just doesn't work that way. This is flat. So in terms of being able to cost effectively sort it, it's flat and it acts like paper, and it's a huge contaminant in our paper stream. And then most importantly, our PET markets don't want it. The basics of plastics are that the number on the product just indicates what kind of resin you started with. So you start with the PET resin, and then you add a whole bunch of different ingredients to make it either behave like a bottle or behave like insulation. And then those different recipes have different properties, different melting points, and they're not able to be recycled together. So there's a huge disconnect, and I think it's important to ask, why do they get to say it's recyclable? There's a huge disconnect, especially in the US, between producers and end of life, and there's very little regulation over who can call their product recyclable and who has to pay for the impact that that has. I think another example to dig into is plastic bags. So when we're talking about when is recycling part of the solution. So plastic bags, technically recyclable. There are those drop-off programs, and those tend to kind of come and go because it's pretty low value material. So there aren't always end markets that want the material. And even after years and years of education and separate programs, it's confusing because they're recyclable, but they're not recyclable in your blue bin. And this is why this photo here shows a star screen, which is a really common piece of technology in recycling facilities that get clogged up with these bags. And so in our facility alone, we spend about $75,000 a year dealing with the impacts of plastic bags, despite education saying to please don't include them, despite separate drop-off programs that deal with them. So this is a case where we would argue our collective effort is best spent to look upstream and reduce and stop the use of this really unnecessary single use of our resources. This is the kind of information that we'll take to the legislature and advocate for policies like plastic bag bans. Which I think kind of leads into this bigger question, like if we can recycle it, why would we look at reducing it? And I just want to point folks to there's a study from the World Resources Institute that says for every cart of discards that we put out, say in the alley, right behind your house, there are 87 carts worth of discards generated upstream just to get that product to you. So when we look at our trash, we think about the impact that item will have in the burner. But the impact is so much bigger than what we can see. And while recycling can play a role in maybe reducing some of those carts, right? It could, in theory, recycling plastic, if it's done well and if it's done right, some plastics we can reduce the need for some extraction upstream. But in reality, that's really hard. For plastics in particular, that's very often not the case. And so reduction is really the only strategy that's going to get us fast enough to the environmental and community health goals that we have concerning climate change. So I think we're going to save some time for Q&A here. And we can really dig into any and all of this, but we want to, of course, end by encouraging everyone to take action. I think there's a lot we can do as individuals in terms of how we spend our dollars. You know, as consumers, try to avoid plastics if we can. The reality is that we don't live in a zero waste world. And to live a zero waste lifestyle takes a pretty incredible amount of time and resources and privilege. Not everybody can make their own toothpaste. And so it's important. I think it's amazing when people do, for the record. But I think it's important for us to also push past that and work collectively to change systems so that everyone has access to products and systems that don't rely on the harmful extractive technologies that Priscilla outlined. And of course, the impacts of those things in the waste stream. And we need to look at who, there are all kinds of great policies. There was a lot of momentum for in Minnesota prior to the pandemic. And we think that there's going to be a whole lot of momentum left to capitalize on when this is over, and a real increased need for us to work collectively for this systems change. We're definitely seeing industry take advantage of this moment to push their agenda, to take advantage of fear and to position single-use plastic as the safe option in this new reality. And I think we need to look at the impacts upstream that Priscilla was talking about and understand that plastics is not a safe option for our world moving forward, and that we need to be more creative and think more holistically about who benefits and who pays. So I'll leave it at that, and it looks like we've got a few questions queued up. I will kick it back over to Kat, and I think have Kate and Priscilla come back on. Wait, I have to stop sharing, or should I just leave it here?
Yeah, leave it here. This is great.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Yes, thanks. We did, we've had a number of questions coming in, so I think we can just jump right into some Q&A. Thanks everybody for submitting your questions. First question is actually just about if we have any research or articles to share that would be helpful to help folks in the audience better understand the issues.
Yeah, so oh gosh, there's so many peer-reviewed articles on different aspects of fracking and petrochemical or plastic production. So what we can do is we can send out links to the Center for International Environmental Law. They have these really great comprehensive reports that speak to all of the cumulative health impacts from plastic production and also the cumulative climate impacts from plastic production. That might be a good place to start. There's so many peer-reviewed articles that are referenced in that, in those reports, so we can share those out as resources as a follow-up.
Wonderful, sounds great. All right. Next question is from Brigida. She asks, when we recycle, is it being actually downcycled? I've heard a lot about plastic and how it can only be downcycled. What do we have to say about that?
Kate, you want to take that one?
Sure. That's a really good question. And so I would not say that all plastic is downcycled. So for example, we do sell some of our milk jugs, plastic milk jugs, and they get turned back into milk jugs, for example. Or we sell some of our plastic bottles and it gets turned back into plastic packaging. May not necessarily always get turned back into a bottle. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it gets turned into that packaging that salad comes in. So it doesn't always necessarily get downcycled, although sometimes it does. A fair amount of our, for example, laundry detergent bottles get turned back into plastic lumber. And this is where that plastic lumber is a durable good. The likelihood of that being recycled again is pretty challenging from a collections perspective. Could, but it's challenging to collect that. So I wouldn't say that all plastic gets downcycled, although I would say that the reality is with the way that mechanical recycling works is every time you melt that plastic down, it loses some of its integrity. And so you can only recycle it so many times. The same is actually true for paper also. It's really only glass and metals that can infinitely be recycled and therefore infinitely not have to, we don't have to mine those virgin materials. Whereas plastic, you're never gonna have an infinite loop with the current infrastructure.
That's great. Sayard is asking about those Amazon paper padded mailers and what we think about those. She sent me a link. I'm not sure if I can pull it up at this moment. But yes, lots of questions about Amazon packaging and all the creative ways that they're sending us stuff in the mail.
So there are a range of Amazon paper padded envelopes. First off, just to say the plastic ones that you get that have the like bubble wrap in the middle of it, those are not recyclable in your curbside recycling program. They are sometimes accepted in drop-off programs at grocery stores. Sometimes you should check your specific drop-off. The ones that have, like if you pour it and it looks like there's kind of little bits of paper that come out, from what we have heard from our paper markets, those are acceptable at this point, although some of the paper envelopes don't have that in the middle of them. Right. So Amazon has put out a variety of packaging. And so we would suggest you do the tear test and see what's in the middle if it looks like paper. I think that gets at a larger issue, which is that we at Eureka and a lot of folks in the movement feel like there needs to be producer responsibility for what they put into the marketplace. Because otherwise the entire burden falls on us as residents to figure out each individual package, and then as recyclers are trying to wade through that as well. So we really feel like there needs to be standards around packaging.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a good rule of thumb for a lot of those new packaging things coming out, that if it's mixed material in any way, if it's plastic and paper, if it's really, then that's just across the board almost always impossible to recycle, with the exception of like milk cartons and juice boxes, which we can talk about later.
Cartons, yep.
Yep.
All right. Kyle asks, if you had to pick one zero waste policy to advocate for right now, what would it be? Good one.
That's a good question.
That's a very good question.
I think maybe the cheater answer could be the Break Free from Plastics Act, because it includes it's so comprehensive, and it addresses extended producer responsibility, meaning whoever's making the product has accountability and has to pay for an appropriate amount for the end of life of that product. It also has recycled content mandates, which create demand for recycled content, so you don't have to compete in the marketplace against heavily subsidized virgin material in order to make recycling work. It's got bans on products that we could easily live without, some of the really junky plastic that there are alternatives for, and some of the single-use products that we just don't need. It's really comprehensive. And I think it's been really, there are a few things we would change, and I think we've got time to work with the authors on that, but that's a federal policy Udall and Lowenthal have put forward, and we're really excited about. Priscilla or Kat, would you answer differently?
I mean,
yeah.
I think it's like you said, it's a good sort of cheater answer. I mean, it's something that you can advocate for now too. Like you can write your, your state or your U.S. representatives and senators to vote in favor of that and or support it. And so, yeah, I think it's something you can act on now, and it's so comprehensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so much of the zero waste stuff speaks so heavily to the resiliency that we need in our systems. And right now that's just become more important than ever. And so, yeah, it's just a kind of a wild time to be witnessing all of this, but we'll see where the policy road takes this, and hopefully we don't have to do too much backtracking, and we can just pick up where we left off with more momentum than ever. All right, next question. All right, I think I skipped one. What suggestions do you have for people to reduce single-use plastics, especially right now when grocers are not allowing reusable bags?
I know, that one hurts right now.
Yes.
It's hard. Yeah. I think that is the reality to that question, is like why we need systems change. It's pretty hard as an individual to avoid single-use plastic as a consumer. There are certainly options for making your own various products, or but even in places where we used to be able to buy in bulk, right now you can't bring your own containers and can't bring your own bags. I know there's a lot of work happening through the Break Free from Plastics movement. Did I mention them? I meant to do that at the end. This is the movement, this amazing global movement that produced the film, The Story of Plastic, the Break Free from Plastic movement that Eureka is heavily engaged in. And there's a lot of work going on there to figure out how to set up systems in the future and how to find, oh, froze. Did I freeze?
I didn't.
You're good.
You're good.
Oh, Kate froze. Set up systems to make reuse and refillables safe, and science that that can back that up. I think there's logic around having control over your container that you've washed and you've brought in and you bring home versus plastic that you have no idea what's happened to it in the interim. So I don't know. That's not a very clear answer. Priscilla or Kat, do you?
Yeah, well, yes, that's great. I would also just put a local shout out to Goat Tote. I had a wonderful conversation with Goat Tote. They just moved here from California. It's a wonderful local business that actually works like, I was referring to it as a red box for reusable grocery bags. You can pick them up and they're all sanitized and good to go. They're way ahead of the game. So I think that they're doing wonderful things, and hopefully they can get into the scene here locally. And I would definitely just wanted to put a shout out to them and support them. I think you can find out more gotote.com.
I just saw this, an anonymous attendee put a comment in saying, put your items in your cart and then take it to your car and have your bags in your car. I saw someone doing that the other day at the co-op and I was like, duh, it's amazing. Yeah. So I wanted to say that that's a really cool strategy.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, there's a lot happening in the chat. I just noticed. Let's see if there's any more questions in the Q&A. Okay, Brigitte asks, what kind of plastics are actually recyclable? Tell us about black plastic and number 7, and what's PLA about? What's recyclable plastic and what's not, and why?
Sure. That's again a question I can answer on behalf of Eureka and our program. It can be contextual because, like I was saying, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered in terms of whether or not something is actually going to get recycled. The reason, so in our program, we accept number 1, number 2, and number 5 plastic food containers. And because we're able to collect enough, we're able to sort it cost effectively, and we have really stable end markets for those products that we have access to information about. I think someone else asked, maybe I'll add in here that all of our material currently stays in North America, 95% in the Midwest and about 85% in Minnesota. So we're lucky that we're in the Midwest. We have markets nearby, and it's something that Eureka has worked really hard on over the years to prioritize local markets for a couple of different reasons. One is because it tends to be easier to trace and find out what's really happening. And then 2, of course, the further you ship something, the more of a carbon impact that has and the less net benefit you have from recycling in general. These are all global commodities and you can sell them all over the world. But you kind of have to do that analysis. So, right, number 7 typically doesn't have end markets at all. And that number 6 is polystyrene. Either, so red Solo cups or expanded styrofoam comes from the same resin. There are some token recycling programs where you can drop it off and it gets like made into a picture frame or something, but generally they're not recyclable. So PLA is a resin made not for recycling, but for composting. And I'm not sure what the question means by compostable or recyclable. But PLA products, like plant-based certified compostable products, should not go in the recycling bin, but should go into composting.
Right.
Is that a good overview?
Yep, that's great.
Kate would probably have been better at that, but I don't know what happened to her.
Oh, good. I'm sure she'll pop back on.
Reemerge.
Yeah. Can we talk just for a second about the how to recycle symbol, and is it a decent guide for people to follow? You know what we're talking about, the how to recycle, flatten the carbon. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. I honestly don't know a whole lot about that. Do you, Kat?
No, same. I've been meaning to really dig into that and try to figure out what that, what the reach is. Where's the funding coming from? And maybe some people here know.
I bet there is somebody watching who might be able to
Sure.
answer that. I don't know if there's probably not a way to patch anybody in, but
Well, we should,
in general, it's always best to check with your local program.
that's the question.
Yeah. And, you know, because it's different community to community because of access to markets or technology in your facility or all of those things. What it takes to really get something recycled is different depending on where you are.
Yeah, exactly. Kyle in the chat wants me to remind people that co-ops are letting people bring their own bags and still use bulk. So I haven't been up to
Oh, mine is not.
Yeah, no.
Mine isn't. Last time I was there, they're the bulk, the gravity bins you can use, but you can't bring your own containers. It might be different co-op to co-op too. I don't know. Yeah.
Great. Okay, next question. How clean should your recycling content be? Yogurt cups, jars, etc., etc.
So generally we say to like give it a rinse.
Quickly.
So you don't need to put it in the dishwasher. You don't need to like scrub it clean. There's just a couple things to remember. If you've ever been on a tour, you know that human beings touch your recycling a lot. So it's just a kindness to the people working with your recycling, that it's not full of gross old food, A. B, generally recycling works like things are sorted by size, weight, and shape. And so if it's half full of peanut butter, it's not going to behave in the same way as an empty jar, and that weight difference could throw it off or mean that it might not get recycled. A little bit of food on it isn't gonna necessarily be a huge problem at the end market because most things are washed well and heated up to a degree that doesn't cause a huge problem, you know, but like no chunks of lasagna, please, or lots of, as clean as you can without like wasting a whole bunch of water.
Good answer. Yes.
All right.
This next question, my apartment actually collects all of the recycling together. So single stream, mixed paper, plastic cans. Yep, it's very common. Is this an effective way to recycle? Effective way to recycle. Okay, there's a couple ways we could approach that. Maybe we could just talk about dual stream versus single stream really quick. And
sure. Yeah. Good question. Single stream. Okay. How do I do this quickly? It's true that the more you mush together recycling, the harder it is to unscramble that egg. And, you know, the more materials get kind of lost or damaged in the process. It's also true that in the last 5 years, technology for dealing with that has improved. But like anything else, how you do it matters, how much you compact it in the truck, how good your education is up front, and how you run the facility to get those materials separated has a huge impact on the results of your single stream program. So someone else, I think, asked what our residual rate was, and residual is the amount of material coming into the facility that has to leave as trash. Either it just wasn't a recyclable material someone put in accidentally, or it got damaged in the process. And our residual rate when we were 2-stream, when papers were all separate from containers, was about 2%, which was really remarkable. And we've crept up to about 6 or 7% since we've gone single stream on average. The industry average is between 20 and 30%. So we're really proud of that. And there's always room for improvement. And I think it's an important question to ask as communities are rebuilding their recycling programs, or some of these, you know, cities like Detroit or Baltimore are kind of starting from scratch. Is single stream the best way to go? It's kind of crazy if you think about the expectation that we have that everything we buy from all these different sources is going to leave our house in 2 or 3 bins and be dealt with in the most beneficial way. So I think it's worth asking, but it's definitely, we've heard a lot of conversation about like, should we just go back to dual stream because we're having such a problem with recyclables now? And, you know, we've put so much money collectively into infrastructure to support single stream programs that the switch back to dual stream is probably a really unrealistic solution at this point.
We have, a couple more. All right, we have a question about composting and compostable cups. And someone's wondering if they've maybe heard that they don't decompose completely, and that there's still some plastic remaining. Lynn, I know you have some insight into the current composting situation.
Yeah, this is there's a piece of legislation that will be be revisited in Minnesota that I really encourage people to understand and support around labeling requirements for compostable products. So the answer to that is, you know, all the products labeled compostable, probably a lot of them are just degradable or biodegradable or oxidegradable, or there's no regulation about what you can put on your products. You could dye styrofoam brown and put an earth on it and call it compostable. In theory, there's regulation around it, but the enforcement really isn't there. So there's really only one way to know if a compostable product is going to actually turn into non-toxic soil amendment, right? And really completely decompose. And that is BPI, the Biodegradable Products Institute, is a third-party certifier. So if I am making a product and I've done all the work to make sure it's going to compost, I have BPI double check. They test it in different labs, have really rigorous testing to make sure that we're not just adding microplastics to the soils or leaving toxins behind. And so when you're looking for compostable products, look for that BPI certification label on them, and then you can be sure that putting it in the compost is a good move.
Yep. That leads right into our next question about PFAS, PFAS, and to-go containers. And should they be trashed, or what happens to that stuff in the incinerator too?
Yeah, that's one of those things, right? Yeah, like PFAS, it's everywhere. It's in stain resistant couches and Teflon pans and clothes, and it's something that we need to go upstream and turn the faucet off on. We need to ban it, but we need to ban it thoughtfully. There's a lot of instances where somebody, you know, a community or a city or a country will try to ban a chemical, but then the replacement chemical ends up being worse than the original. So there are groups like Safer States and Healthy Legacy who are looking at bills that help reduce toxins on a more holistic level, and PFAS is a huge issue. It's certainly being addressed at the state level in Minnesota as well. And BPI has recently added into their certification process that there can't be any intentionally added PFAS to any compostable products that are certified compostable. So another reason to look for that certification symbol is if it's a BPI certified product. As of January, it can't have any added PFAS. Is that helpful? I mean, what should we do with them? Like if you bought them before January, should you trash them? I mean, I don't know. I think Susan is watching. I wonder if she could chat her thoughts about that.
Tell us what you think in the chat box.
Yeah.
We can get to that. Not a good situation overall.
Right.
But hopefully figure something out moving forward. Sayard is asking about, from an outreach or a policy standpoint, she's asking about the terms single stream and commingling, and wondering if we think those are confusing to the residents. If single stream and commingling are confusing terms from a perspective of a MRF. Yeah. What do we think? Definitely.
Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Yeah.
Sorry, my computer crashed, so I'm on my phone.
Awesome.
I think I think they're both confusing. I think commingled is a little more confusing because I think single stream has become so regularly used, because you can have dual stream where the paper is commingled and the containers are commingled. So I think in terms of confusion to the resident, I think it makes the most sense to use single stream or single sort, not commingle.
Great. Yeah. All right.
There's some questions in the comments section, Kat.
It looks like we've just got people sharing some resources in the comment section. Got how to recycle as part of the Green Blue Alliance. Members have to pay to join, and they can put on how to recycle onto their product, a label onto their product.
Okay.
So we'll look more into iPad. Number of people asking about that as well, so that's great. But no, I think we have just a few more minutes if anyone does have any final questions. Oh, here we go. Ali asks, Lynn mentioned producer responsibility. In the industry, do you see any movement towards more EPR? What are the main obstacles you see to adopt EPR practices in the US? Thank you, Ali.
That's a great question. We are seeing a lot more movement, and Kate, you can fill in here too, please. I think that we're in this really interesting time where there's a lot of different definition about, or different ideas about what an EPR system could look like or should look like. There's a few examples in Europe and Canada, all of which have their own set of challenges. What kind of products, how is it regulated? What's the system by which producers are paying in? Who's managing that money and how that money is spent on supporting recycling infrastructure? Who can receive the money, what they can spend it on? All of those questions are kind of being sorted out in real time. There's some really innovative or kind of leading edge policies in Washington State and in Maine that are looking at pretty comprehensive EPR bills. There's a lot of kind of devil in the details to work out there, including some of the questions we were talking about, like what is the definition of recyclable? If your product is recyclable, you probably don't have to pay as much as if your product isn't, but is it being made of PET doesn't mean it's recyclable. So, how is that getting defined and who? And the main obstacles, towards keeping any kind of teeth or authenticity into these policies is just the gigantic money and power of the lobbyists of the American Chemistry Council and other big industry players.
I think one of the other interesting dynamics that we're seeing, you're definitely seeing across the industry also a call for national policy, because any industry doesn't want to deal with 50 different EPR policies across 50 different states. The challenge there is what Lynn just said, which is they have powerful lobbyists and a lot more money and time to be at the federal government to advocate for national EPR. But I also think there's an interesting split between some of the petrochemical industries and the brands. The brands are getting so much pressure on them, at least up through until COVID started, that they're supporting some EPR that maybe the American Chemistry Council isn't supporting. There's some interesting splits that are happening in industry that you never would have seen before. I also just want to highlight too that we are starting to see some recyclers come out against certain types of EPR because they're concerned that they won't be included in a brand run EPR system, that their MRFs, that the brands will go build their own MRFs essentially. So there's a lot of devil in the details in terms of how it will get implemented, but it is there's definitely been a shift in the last 2 to 3 years of there now being a conversation as opposed to it just shutting down.
Wonderful. Well, fascinating questions. Thank you all for participating. That puts us at time. We are at 2 o'clock. So we had a great turnout today and lots of awesome participation. Thank you all for being here. We will consider a follow-up. Maybe we can continue these discussions, or maybe we can do some fireside chats with Eureka or something in the future. Who knows what.
That'd be cool.
But we will
make some s'mores.
this, yes, and we will share with everyone who registered, so you can view later. We also have this up on Facebook as well. It was live streaming, so you can find it there as well if you'd like to reference it later. So yes, thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Priscilla. Thanks Kat.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Everyone.